The body was found at Hour 23, Rotation 17. Slumped in Confession Booth 47, Underhive Market District of Varos 9. No wounds, no cuts, no trauma visible to the medic's practiced eye. Cardiac arrest, they concluded. The heart had simply stopped. Clean death. Except for one detail. The dead man's mouth hung open, jaw slack as if frozen mid-scream. And on the rockcrete wall behind him, written in what appeared to be his own blood, though no injury could explain its source, a single word glistened wet under flickering lumen light. Guilty. 0.2 seconds. That was how long the name Light Yagami appeared on Census Vault Screen 7A, before dissolving into authorized identity Lumen Callus. Verified. The clerk saw it, logged it as data corruption, filed it under Hive Decay Ignore, and Proceed. Standard protocol for a dying world where systems failed daily and no one had resources to investigate every glitch. But Adept Lumen Callus saw it too, and he did not ignore it. The vault was cold. Stone walls that predated living memory. Steel doors groaning on hinges older than most Imperial governors. The hum of machinery constant, eternal, outlasting the engineers who had built it and the scribes who maintained it now. Lumen approached the picked recognition scanner data slate held under one arm. His seal ring caught the sickly yellow glow from overhead lumens as he placed his hand on the verification plate. The clerk barely glanced up. His face had the pallor of someone who worked too many shifts beneath artificial light eyes, red-rimmed and hollow. Sign here, Adept. The screen flickered. Green phosphor radiance. Then text in crisp Gothic script, Lumen Callus, verified. But for 0.2 seconds, another name had materialized beneath it. Light Yagami. Foreign imprint. Data corruption. A servo skull drifted past at precisely that moment, red eye lens sweeping the corridor in mechanical patrol. The security feed stuttered. Static. Resume. The glitch vanished into faulty memory banks that would never be repaired. The clerk muttered something about decaying infrastructure and signed the access log without checking twice. Vault 7. Don't touch anything outside your requisition. Lumen withdrew his hand. The name, his true name, had already dissolved back into the system's accumulated errors. He adjusted his cuffs with habitual precision. Of course. He walked deeper into the vault. The air tasted of parchment dust and oxidized metal. Rows of shelves stretched into darkness, each laden with bundled documents, data crystals, pick captures, sealed in evidence containers. This was where Varos 9 stored its documented truth birth records, death certificates, criminal registries, faces captured by security apparatus, and filed away for future reference, for future elimination. Lumen's requisition was legitimate. He was a scribe grade 3, assigned to cross-reference census data against mortality reports. Tedious work that drove older adepts to early retirement or drink, but it provided access. Access to names, access to faces, access to the Imperium's raw data of human existence. He located the file he required. Ganglord. Designation Vex Haron. Wanted for 17 confirmed murders, narcotics, trafficking, extortion across 3 hive levels. But local Arbites had insufficient evidence for prosecution. No witnesses willing to testify. No picked captures with adequate clarity to authorize execution. So Vex Haron remained free. Another entry in the endless ledger of criminals who understood how to manipulate the system, how to bribe appropriate officials, how to silence witnesses permanently. Lumen opened the file. Inside lay everything that mattered: registered name, birth date, picked capture from his most recent arrest. He studied the face. Middle-aged, scarred tissue across the left cheek, eyes that reflected familiarity with violence and complete absence of conscience. He committed every detail to memory, then closed the file and returned it to its designated position. The logs would show only routine census work, authorized access, nothing irregular. Outside the vault, Varos 9 continued its slow collapse. The hive world had been prosperous once. A cornerstone of imperial production in segmentum obscurus, contributing vast quotas of manufactured goods and processed materials. But that was before the grain shortages, before the labor riots, before Adeptus Arbites had implemented order through systematic brutality rather than actual law enforcement. Lumen moved through streets where the fortunate worked themselves toward death in manufactorums, and the desperate starved in alleys. Acid rain fell from lead-gray skies, leaving chemical burns on anyone foolish enough to venture outside without protective covering. The atmosphere carried the permanent stench of promethium exhaust and decomposing refuse. Everywhere the Aquila stared down from buildings and monuments, the double-headed eagle of the Imperium, eternal symbol of authority, spanning a million worlds. Everywhere, citizens bowed heads and murmured prayers to the God-Emperor of mankind, begging for deliverance that would never manifest. Lumen had observed this world for months now, had analyzed its systems, its enforcement mechanisms, its fundamental failures. The Arbites arrested suspects based on quota fulfillment rather than evidence. The ecclesiarchy preached obedience while extracting tithes from populations who could barely afford sustenance. The planetary governor counted wealth in his spire while millions suffered in the levels below. And Lumen had reached a simple conclusion: Lex Imperialis was not justice. It was authorized violence, cruelty legitimized through documentation. He had witnessed the execution 3 days prior. A manufactorum worker arrested for theft. No trial, no investigation, simply a bolt round through the skull in a public square, the Arbites marshal declaring that order must be maintained at any cost. The worker's crime, stealing nutrient paste to feed his children. Lumen had stood in that crowd and felt something crystallize inside him. Not anger, not grief, just cold recognition that the system functioned exactly as designed, and the design was fundamentally broken. That night, he had acquired the Mortis Codex. It had been stored in an Arbites evidence vault confiscated during a raid on suspected heretics. The cult had been purged, its members burned its artifacts, cataloged and archived. No one understood what the Codex actually did. No one particularly cared. It was merely another relic filed under potential damnation and effectively forgotten. But Lumen possessed access to those archives. Scribe privileges granted him entry to files others never saw. He had read the description: ancient text origin, unknown, impossible to damage or destroy, covered in names inscribed with what appeared to be human blood. The Arbites had attempted incineration, attempted crushing, attempted every crude method their limited imagination could conceive. The Codex had remained pristine, so Lumen had taken it. Not stolen, properly acquired. Through carefully forged requisitions and precisely applied administrative seals. He had learned early that within the Imperium authority consisted merely of correct signatures on correct forms. Now the Codex resided in his quarters, waiting, silent. He had opened it that first night and inscribed a name: Vex Haran. Gang lord, murderer, a criminal whose offenses were thoroughly documented yet remained unpunished. The Codex had not reacted. No illumination, no sound, no response whatsoever. Just ink absorbed into ancient pages indistinguishable from any standard ledger entry. But the following morning, Vex Heron was discovered dead. Cardiac arrest, no wounds, no toxins detected. Simply a body that had ceased functioning as if vital organs had collectively decided to terminate operation. The Arbites ruled it natural causes, filed their report, moved on to the next case. But Lumen knew, and knowing he understood what he now possessed. In the Imperium, justice was luxury reserved for those with influence. Law was merely another tool of oppression. Faith was currency traded by those who had never witnessed the Emperor and never would. But judgment could be delivered with precision. He opened the codex again and inscribed another name, then another. Gang enforcers, corrupt administratum officials, those who killed and exploited and walked free because they had mastered navigation through a system designed to protect the powerful. Within one standard week, 11 were dead. All cardiac failure, all medically inexplicable. And in the Underhive, where citizens existed like vermin in perpetual darkness, whispers began circulating. They called it Kira. Judgment. Punishment delivered by some power that perceived through walls and penetrated into souls. Lumen heard those whispers and allowed himself the smallest satisfaction. Not because he derived pleasure from death, but because finally, after months observing the Imperium crush innocence while rewarding guilt, something functioned correctly. The system contained a flaw, and he had identified the exploit. He was not divine, not the Emperor, not even particularly special. Just a scribe with access to appropriate files and an appropriate tool. But that he was beginning to comprehend might prove sufficient. That night in his quarters, he opened the codex once more. The pages now held 11 names, 11 deaths, hundreds more waiting. Outside Varos 9 continued its inevitable decay. Inside Lumen, Callus adjusted his cuffs and began calculating next steps. Within the Imperium, a name was merely documentation, registry, something to be stamped, filed, archived, eventually forgotten in the endless bureaucratic machinery holding 40,000 worlds together. But he had learned something the system never intended anyone to discover. Paper could kill. Far above in cold orbit where inquisitorial vessels maintained sector patrol, a data slate chimed with priority alert. Pattern deaths, 11 confirmed, 17 suspected. 0 forensic commonality across all cases, except one detail. Perfect target selection. Inquisitor Seraphine Cord read the report twice. Her augmented eye processed data streams, while her human eye studied pattern recognition matrices. Then, she opened new case file designation and entered classification in vermilion ink. Kira pattern. Classification extremis. Investigation status active. She closed the file and issued orders to her command staff. Prepare my cutter for planetfall. Varos 9. Immediate departure. Her officers moved to comply without question. They had served under Cord long enough to recognize that tone. Someone had attracted inquisitorial attention, and in the Imperium, that was rarely survivable. The test required precision. Lumen sat in his quarters, a space barely larger than a servitor's maintenance alcove. One cot, one table, one lumen strip that flickered every 17 minutes. The codex lay open before him, its pages absorbing the weak light without reflecting any back. He had written 11 names, 11 deaths, all cardiac arrest, all unexplained. But he needed to understand the parameters, the limitations, whether the codex was tool or master. He opened to a blank page and wrote carefully in Gothic script, Test Subject 12. Barthus Venn, Underhive smuggler, wanted for 6 murders, known associate of the serrated hand gang. Then below the name, he added specific instructions. Time of death hour, 6, rotation 18. Location, his usual drinking establishment, the Rust Valve. Method, cardiac arrest after public confession of crimes. He set down the stylus and waited. The codex did not react. No glow, no warmth. Just ink on ancient parchment as inert as any census record. Lumen closed it and checked his chronometer. Hour 23 now. 7 hours until the specified time. He would know then whether the codex could be programmed or whether it simply killed according to its own design. He did not sleep. Instead, he reviewed census files cross-referencing names against Arbite's records, building lists of targets, gang leaders, corrupt enforcement officers, administratum officials who embezzled while citizens starved. The work was methodical, emotionless, just data processing. At hour 6, rotation 18, he accessed the Underhive Vox network through a smuggled receiver. The channels were chaos, multiple frequencies overlapping criminal elements, coordinating shipments, citizens trading rumors, Arbites dispatching patrols. Then on frequency 77, a transmission cut through the noise. Medikey to the Rust Valve, level 214, cardiac event, subject deceased. Witnesses report the victim was... He was confessing something about murders and the serrated hand. Audio log captured. Send Arbites immediately. Lumen closed the connection and sat very still. The codex had obeyed. Not just the death, the behavior, the location, the timing, everything specified. He opened it again and studied the entry. The ink had changed. No longer fresh black, but faded brown, as if the page had aged decades in hours. The words remained legible, but looked ancient now, like historical record rather than recent instruction. The codex was not just killing, it was documenting, creating permanent testimony of judgment rendered. Lumen allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he began planning the next phase. 3 days later, the Underhive Market District received its first direct message. The body was found in confession booth 47, the same location where the original guilty marking had appeared. This victim was a gang enforcer named Crate, known for protection rackets that had left 17 shop owners dead when they refused payment. No wounds, no trauma, cardiac arrest. But this time there was more than blood writing on the wall. A voice recording had been left on the confession booth's audio system, activated by proximity trigger. When the first citizen approached the body, the recording played. Crate's voice distorted and mechanical speaking words he should not have known. I confess, 17 murders. The names are... And then a complete list, accurate to every detail, including crimes the Arbites had never connected to him. The recording ended with a single word, in a different voice, deeper, resonant, artificial. Judgment. The citizen who discovered it fled. Within an hour, the entire market district knew. Within 3 hours, the whispers had spread to 5 hive levels. Kira was not random chance. Kira was deliberate, intelligent, watching. And Kira made criminals confess before they died. Lumen observed the reaction from the census vault, monitoring Vox chatter through official channels. The Arbites were confused. The ecclesiarchy was alarmed. Common citizens were beginning to whisper prayers not to the emperor, but to this new power that seemed to punish the guilty when official justice failed. He had created a signature, a pattern, something people could recognize and fear or worship depending on their conscience. But he also knew patterns attracted attention. In the vault's restricted archive section, he accessed files that most scribes never saw. Intelligence reports, inquisitorial alerts, sector-wide threat assessments. And their dated 2 rotations prior was a new entry. Priority alert. Segmentum obscurus pattern deaths. Detected Veros 9, multiple sectors. Classification. Chiara pattern designation provisional. Characteristics. Cardiac failure no, forensic evidence. Selective targeting of criminal elements. Assessment. Possible psyker manifestation. Possible Xenos influence possible tech heresy. Action investigation authorized. Inquisitor. Seraphine Cord, Ordo Hereticus assigned. Estimated arrival. 14 rotations. Lumen read it twice. Then he accessed Cord's service record. Inquisitor. Ordo Hereticus. 43 confirmed heresy purges, known for methodical investigation and absolute thoroughness. Specialized in rooting out corruption within imperial institutions. No failed cases on record. She was not coming to understand Kira. She was coming to eliminate it. 14 rotations, less than 2 standard weeks. He closed the file and returned to his desk. The codex waited. He had 2 choices. Stop now, disappear into the vast bureaucracy of the Imperium, hope the investigation found nothing. Or escalate. Create enough chaos that Cord would have to choose between hunting Kira and maintaining basic order. Lumen opened the codex and began writing names. Not 1, not 3, 15. All significant gang leaders, corrupt officials, and black market operators whose deaths would create immediate power vacuums across multiple hive sectors. All scheduled to die within the next 72 hours. He was not stopping. He was accelerating. If Cord wanted to find Kira, she would have to do it in the middle of a war. Far above Veros 9. In the cold orbit where warships maintained eternal vigil, Inquisitor Seraphine Cord stood on the bridge of her cutter, the unrelenting verdict. The view screen showed the hive world below, gray and brown, scarred by industrial waste wrapped in perpetual clouds of pollution. A dying world, standard for the Imperium's manufacturing sectors. But something was happening there. Something that defied normal patterns of crime and punishment. Her astropath Liz stood nearby, face hidden behind traditional blindfold. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if listening to sounds only she could perceive. "The deaths continue," Liz said quietly. "I can feel them in the warp. Not violent, not passionate, just cessation, like candles being snuffed by deliberate hand." Cord's augmented eye processed data streams from surface sensors. "How many since we received the initial report?" 17, all within criminal populations, all cardiac failure. Lise paused. "And there is something else. The deaths are creating echoes. Not warp corruption, but resonance. People are beginning to believe in something, to hope or fear, depending on their guilt." "Faith." Cord said the word carrying disgust. "Someone is building faith, using death as foundation. Perhaps. Or perhaps death is merely removing obstacles, revealing what was always beneath." Liz turned her blindfolded face toward the Inquisitor. "I cannot sense deception in these deaths, only precision." Cord considered this. In her decades of service, she had learned that precision was more dangerous than chaos. Chaos could be burned away. Precision required understanding before elimination. "Accelerate our approach," she ordered the bridge crew. "I want planetfall within 6 rotations instead of 14. "By your will, Inquisitor." As the ship's engines burned brighter, pushing the cutter toward Veros 9 at increased speed, Cord opened a secure file on her data slate. She began writing preliminary assessment notes. Subject, Kira pattern hypothesis. Intelligent actor, not random phenomenon. Evidence, target selection requires information access. Deaths show planning, not impulse. Conclusion: someone within the system is using the system's own data against it. She paused, stylus hovering over the screen, then added one final line. Counter strategy: deny information. If Kira needs names and faces to kill, eliminate access to names and faces. She closed the file and looked out at Varos 9, growing larger in the view screen. Somewhere down there, someone thought they could judge the Imperium citizens. They were about to learn that the Imperium did not tolerate competition, not even from justice. The 15 deaths happened over 72 hours. Gang lords collapsed at planning tables. Corrupt Arbeits officers died during shift changes. Black market operators seized mid-transaction hearts, stopping as if some invisible hand had reached through ribs and crushed the muscle to silence. No warnings. No patterns visible to those watching. Just bodies accumulating faster than the Medici could process them. By hour 16 of the third rotation, the Underhive had descended into chaos. 3 gangs were suddenly leaderless, their lieutenants scrambling for control. 2 RBT's precincts were operating without senior command, junior officers paralyzed by fear of making decisions that might attract the same fate. Administratum officials began calling in sick, terrified that some unknown accountant of sins had added their names to a list. And in the markets, in the drinking halls, in the cramped HAB units, where citizens gathered to share rumors, a single word circulated like forbidden scripture. Kira. Lumen observed the collapse from the census vault, monitoring Vox channels and data traffic. The Arbeits were requesting reinforcements from 3 neighboring hive sectors. The ecclesiarchy had dispatched confessors to preach order and imperial faith. The planetary governor had issued emergency decrees authorizing summary execution for anyone spreading seditious rumors. None of it mattered. The fear had taken root. He had created something beyond simple terror. He had created doubt in the system itself. If Arbeits officers could die despite their authority, if gang lords could fall despite their power, then perhaps the Imperium's hierarchy was not as absolute as everyone had been taught to believe. Perhaps something stronger existed, something that judged by different rules. The thought should have satisfied him. But Lumen felt only cold calculation. This was just phase 1. Chaos was a tool, not an objective. What mattered now was controlling the narrative before someone else did. Confessor Halbrecht stood in the Cathedral of the Throne, facing a congregation of 3,000. The massive Gothic structure dominated the mid-hive, its spires reaching toward skies they would never penetrate. Stained glass depicted the Emperor in golden armor, crushing Xenos beneath his boots, while the faithful knelt in worship. Halbrecht's voice carried through Vox amplification, filling the cathedral with sound that resonated in bone and blood. "You have heard the whispers," he began, hands gripping the pulpit's edges. "You have heard the name spoken in darkness, Kira. Some call it judgment. Some call it divine retribution. Some whisper that it is the Emperor's own hand finally descending to punish the wicked who have escaped mortal justice." The congregation murmured. Halbrecht let the sound build before raising one hand for silence. "But I tell you this, faithful of Varos 9, fear is not weakness. Fear is the rope by which the Emperor pulls wandering souls back to righteousness. These deaths are not chaos. They are reminder. Reminder that guilt cannot hide. That sin cannot escape accounting. Whether by Arbeits, bolt round, or by mysterious heart failure, the Emperor sees all, judges all, and through his infinite mechanisms, punishes all." He paused, letting the words sink into minds desperate for explanation. Let the wicked tremble. Let those who have profited from suffering know that their time is measured. Let Kira, whatever its nature, serve as proof that faith in the Emperor's justice is never misplaced, even when that justice arrives through unexpected channels. The congregation erupted in fervent prayer. Halbrecht stepped back from the pulpit, satisfaction warming his chest. He had just transformed a potential heresy into theological asset. If the deaths continued, they would strengthen faith rather than undermine it. If they stopped, the ecclesiarchy could claim victory through prayer. Either way, Halbrecht had seized control of the narrative. 3 levels below the cathedral, in an Arbites precinct fortress that smelled of gun oil and fear, Marshal Venn reviewed casualty reports. 2 of his officers were dead. Both had been under investigation for evidence tampering and protection racket participation. Both had died of cardiac arrest with no witnesses and no explanation. Venn was a practical man. He had served the Arbites for 23 years, enforcing law in 5 different hive worlds. He understood that justice and law were not always the same thing. That sometimes the system protected the guilty and punished the innocent. That enforcement was about maintaining order, not achieving moral perfection. But this was different. Kira, whatever it was, had better investigative capability than his entire precinct. It identified criminals the Arbites could not touch. It executed judgment without trials, without bureaucracy, without the corruption that infected every level of imperial justice. It was efficient. And efficiency in a galaxy drowning in inefficiency was dangerously seductive. Venn closed the files and stood walking to the narrow window that overlooked the precinct's detention block. 24 cells currently holding gang members awaiting trial. Trials that would probably never happen because witnesses kept disappearing and evidence kept vanishing into administratum black holes. He made a decision. Opening a secure Vox channel, he transmitted a message on a frequency known only to certain elements of the Underhive. Not criminals, intermediaries. People who facilitated communication between those who operated outside official channels. The message was simple. To Kira, the Arbites have files, names, faces, evidence the courts cannot or will not use. If your purpose is genuine, these files could be useful. If you wish to discuss cooperation, respond through this channel. Marshal Venn, Precinct Fortress 7. He closed the transmission and waited. Either Kira would respond, proving it was intelligent and communicative, or it would ignore him, confirming it was simple force of nature. Or it would kill him, demonstrating that it recognized no authority but its own. Venn found himself curious which outcome would manifest. Lumen received the transmission 4 hours later. He had been monitoring Arbites' frequencies since the escalation began, tracking their investigation efforts. Most were predictable: increased patrols, informant networks, threats of reprisal against anyone harboring heretical elements. But Venn's message was different. It was not threat or investigation. It was offer. Lumen sat very still, analyzing the implications. An Arbites marshal was offering cooperation, offering access to official files that would expand Kira's reach exponentially. It was exactly what Light needed: more data, more names, more faces to target. But it was also trap potential, a way to trace communication, to identify whoever responded to, narrow the search for Kira's true identity, unless the offer was genuine. Lumen pulled Venn's service record from the Census Vault's restricted archive. 23 years, multiple commendations, but also buried in confidential notes, 3 investigations into questionable conduct, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence or conflicting testimony. Venn was not corrupt in the traditional sense, but he was someone who bent rules when he believed the rules were wrong. Someone who prioritized results over procedure. a radical in inquisitorial terminology. Someone who might genuinely believe Kira served the Emperor's will better than official channels did. Lumen made his decision. He crafted a response, routed through 17 different Vox relays to prevent tracing voice modulated to remove any identifying characteristics. Marshal Venn, your offer is noted. Proof of sincerity required. Provide one file. A criminal your system cannot touch. If the file is genuine and the target is eliminated, further cooperation may be discussed. Do not attempt to trace this transmission. Do not inform your superiors. If either occurs, our communication ends. Kira. He sent the message and waited. 13 minutes later, Venn's response arrived. A single encrypted data packet containing complete dossier on an administrative official named Corso Halm. Evidence of embezzlement, worker exploitation, 3 suspected murders. But Halm had connections to the planetary governor's office, untouchable by normal enforcement. The file included everything Lumen needed: registered name, birth date, current residence, daily routine, picked capture from official census records. Lumen opened the codex and inscribed the name. Corso Halm. Death, cardiac arrest. Location his office. Time hour 12 following rotation. Behavior prior to death. Verbal confession of crimes to office staff. He closed the codex and sent a final message to Venn. File received. Watch your office tomorrow hour 12. If you see justice served, we will speak again. Far above, Inquisitor Cord's cutter entered Varos 9's orbital space. Her astropath, Liss, stood at the bridge viewport, blindfolded, face turned toward the planet below. She tilted her head, listening to something only she could perceive. "The pattern accelerates," Liss said quietly. "Many deaths, close together. Someone is pushing hard, creating disruption deliberately." Cord studied tactical displays showing hive sector layouts. "Or someone knows we are coming and wants to create chaos before we arrive. Make investigation more difficult." "Perhaps. But there is something else." Liss paused. "I sense communication. Not warp-touched, but present. Someone is talking to someone. Negotiating. Can you identify the parties?" "No. But the resonance suggests authority figures. Official channels being used for unofficial purposes." Cord made a notation in her data slate. "Hypothesis: Kira is recruiting, seeking allies within the system." She looked at the planet below. Somewhere down there, an intelligent actor was building a network, using death as demonstration of capability, drawing others into conspiracy through appeal to frustrated idealism. It was exactly the kind of corruption the Ordo Hereticus existed to burn out. "Prepare drop teams," she ordered. "We go to surface within the hour. I want immediate access to all Arbeits records, all administratum files, all census data. And I want everything scrubbed from local networks and transferred to secure storage on this ship." Her officers moved to comply. If Kira needed information to kill, she would starve it of information, and then she would watch what moved in the darkness. Corso Halm died at hour 12, exactly as scheduled. He had been reviewing embezzlement ledgers in his administratum office when his heart stopped. His last words, witnessed by 3 subordinates, were a complete confession of financial crimes spanning 7 years. The staff fled. The body was discovered 20 minutes later. By hour 13, Marshal Venn had received confirmation through official channels. By hour 14, an encrypted message reached Lumen through the same Vox relay network. "Proof accepted. I have access to 17 high-priority files the Arbeits cannot prosecute. Full dossiers, picked captures, movement patterns. Transmitting now." The data packet arrived moments later. Lumen opened it in his quarters, the codex resting beside his data slate. 17 names. Gang leaders operating across multiple hive sectors. Corrupt officials with connections to the planetary governor. Black market operators who had bribed their way out of a dozen investigations. All documented. All unpunishable by normal channels. All now vulnerable. But Lumen did not open the codex immediately. Instead, he studied the files themselves, analyzing not just the targets, but the metadata. File creation dates, access logs, authorization codes. These were official Arbites records, which meant they existed in the central Arbites database, which meant anyone with sufficient clearance could access them, which meant Cord would have access. He needed to move faster than investigation could follow. But he also needed to think beyond immediate targets. The 17 names Venn provided were useful, but limited. What Lumen required was not just data, but the ability to acquire data independently. He needed higher access. The census vault gave him civilian records. Venn's cooperation provided criminal intelligence. But there were entire categories of potential targets he could not reach: senior administratum officials, ecclesiarchy hierarchy, Arbites command structure. Those files existed, but they were restricted, protected by authorization codes he did not possess, unless he could acquire them. Lumen reviewed the Census Vault's personnel roster: 47 scribes of various grades, 12 archivists, 3 senior administrators with elevated clearance, and 1 vault keeper, an elderly adept named Methodius, who had served in the position for 32 years and possessed authorization to access nearly every database on Veros 9. Methodius was not corrupt. He was not criminal. He was simply the keeper of keys. And Lumen needed those keys. He began planning. Inquisitor Cord stood in the Arbite's central command center, watching as her tech priests interfaced with the precinct's primary data core. The room was controlled chaos. Arbites officers moved between stations, coordinating patrol routes and responding to the ongoing gang conflicts. Marshal Venn stood nearby, posture rigid, clearly unhappy about inquisitorial presence but unwilling to voice objection. Cord's lead tech priest, Enginsir Dax, worked at the main terminal mechadendrites plugged directly into the command console. "Status," Cord said. Dax's voice carried the flat modulation of extensive augmentation. "Primary database access achieved. Beginning transfer of all criminal record census files and surveillance footage to secure storage aboard your vessel. Estimated completion 6 hours. Acceptable. Once transfer is complete, scrub the local copies. Leave only basic operational data." "Understood, Inquisitor." Venn stepped forward. "With respect, Inquisitor, if you remove our investigative files, we cannot perform basic law enforcement functions." Cord's augmented eye focused on him. "Marshal, your law enforcement has failed to prevent 17 high-value deaths in as many days. Your files are clearly compromised, either by the killer directly or by someone providing the killer with information, until I determine which all sensitive data will be secured." Ben's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Cord recognized the expression. Not submission. Calculation. He was deciding whether to cooperate or obstruct. "Marshal Venn," she said quietly, "I have read your service record. 23 years, multiple commendations, but also 3 investigations into conduct violations, all dismissed, but all suggesting a certain flexibility regarding procedure. The Arbites Code allows for operational discretion. Inquisitor?" "Indeed, which is why you are still serving rather than on a penal colony. But discretion has limits. If you are cooperating with Kira, providing files, offering assistance that crosses from discretion into heresy. Ven met her gaze. I am not a heretic inquisitor. I am a law enforcement officer trying to maintain order on a dying world with insufficient resources and overwhelming crime. If someone else is achieving results, I cannot. I would be a fool not to pay attention. Attention is one thing. Collaboration is another. Remember which side of that line you stand on, Marshal. Cord turned back to the screens. The conversation was over, but she made mental note. Ven was not yet complicit, but he was vulnerable. If Kira approached him, or had already approached him, he might accept, which meant Ven required monitoring. Lumen waited until the third shift began before approaching Vault Keeper Methodius. The old man was alone in his office, a cramped space filled with parchment ledgers and data slates dating back decades. Methodius believed in redundancy. Every electronic record had physical backup. Every classification had handwritten log. It made him meticulous. It also made him predictable. Vault Keeper, Lumen said from the doorway. Forgive the intrusion. I need authorization for restricted archive access. There is discrepancy in mortality census that requires cross-reference with sealed files. Methodius looked up, his eyes magnified behind thick optical lenses. Which files? Administratum personnel records, senior grade. I believe there may be duplicate registration under different names. Census integrity issue. It was plausible lie. Duplicate registrations happened frequently in a bureaucracy this size. Methodius frowned, but nodded slowly. Fill out requisition form. I will review tomorrow. The Inquisition is conducting investigation on world, Lumen said carefully. They are requesting comprehensive census verification. If I wait until tomorrow, I may miss deadline and draw inquisitorial scrutiny to our entire vault. The mention of Inquisition had immediate effect. Methodius stiffened. What investigation? Pattern deaths. They are reviewing all records. I am attempting to ensure our files are beyond reproach before they arrive here. It was not quite lie. Cord would inevitably review census vault. And Methodius, like most Imperial functionaries, feared inquisitorial attention above all else. The Vault Keeper stood slowly retrieving a keyring from his desk. Very well. But you will work under my supervision. I will not have irregularities in my vault. Of course, Vault Keeper. Methodius led him to the restricted archive section, a reinforced chamber behind triple-sealed doors. Inside were files that most scribes never saw senior official dossiers classified, Arbites reports, ecclesiarchy hierarchy records, and the access terminal connected to all of it. Methodius unlocked the terminal and entered his authorization codes. The screen illuminated, showing cascading menus of restricted databases. What specifically do you need? Administratum personnel senior grade past 5 years. Methodius navigated to the appropriate files and stepped aside. You have 15 minutes. I will be monitoring from my office. He left the door remaining open, per protocol. Lumen sat at the terminal and worked quickly. He did not access the files he had mentioned. Instead, he navigated to system administration functions, opened a backdoor subroutine he had prepared weeks ago, and installed it into the terminal's core programming. The subroutine was elegant. It would record Methodius's authorization codes every time he logged in, then transmit those codes to a receiving device Lumen had hidden in the vault's ventilation system. Within 3 days, Lumen would have complete access to restricted files without needing Methodius's cooperation. He spent the remaining 12 minutes actually reviewing administratum personnel records, creating legitimate work product in case Methodius checked. Then he logged out and returned to the vault keeper's office. "No duplicates found," he reported. "Census integrity appears sound." Methodius nodded, already returning to his ledgers. "Good. File your report with standard documentation." "Of course, Vault Keeper." Lumen left the vault and returned to his quarters. In 3 days, he would have access to nearly every restricted database on Varus 9. Senior officials, ecclesiarchy priests, Arbites command structure, governor's office. The targets Cord thought she was protecting by scrubbing Arbites' files would still be vulnerable, because Cord was focused on denying access to existing databases. She had not yet considered that someone might be creating new access. In her command center, aboard the Unrelenting Verdict, Cord reviewed preliminary reports. Her tech priests had completed transfer of Arbites' criminal files. Census data would be next, then administratum records. Within 48 hours, every significant database on Varus 9 would be secured on her vessel, beyond reach of anyone planetside. Astropath Liss entered the chamber, her blindfolded face turned toward Cord with uncanny precision. "The deaths have stopped," Liss said quietly. Cord looked up from her data slate. "Stopped. For 18 hours now. No new pattern deaths. The resonance I sensed has gone quiet. Kira knows we are here, knows we are moving against it, so it waits." Cord stood walking to the viewport that showed Varus 9 below. "Or it is preparing something." "There is something else," Liss continued. "I sense anticipation, not from many minds, but from one. Someone down there is not afraid. Someone is planning." Cord considered this. Most criminals, when confronted with inquisitorial investigation, either fled or panicked. But Kira had demonstrated intelligence, strategy. It would not simply wait to be caught. She pulled up a file on her data slate, one she had been constructing since arrival, a theoretical profile of whoever was using the name Kira. Hypothesis. Subject possesses information access within Imperial bureaucracy, likely administratum or Arbites personnel. Demonstrates advanced planning capability. No evidence of psychic ability kills appear to require target knowledge, not direct observation. Vulnerability. Subject requires data, names, faces, locations. Without access to this information, killing capacity is neutralized. Counter strategy, Phase 2. After denying access to existing databases, identify who has been accessing those databases recently. Cross-reference access logs with death patterns. Narrow suspect pool. She sent orders to her tech priests. When you complete Census Vault data transfer, I want complete access logs for the past 6 months. Every file opened, every terminal used, every authorization code entered. Focus particularly on files related to deceased individuals. The acknowledgement came immediately. By your will, Inquisitor. Cord returned to the viewport. Somewhere down there, Kira was planning next move. But every move required information, and she was systematically eliminating information sources. Eventually, Kira would have to surface, would have to take risks to acquire new targets. And when that happened, she would be waiting. The file arrived through Ven's encrypted channel 3 days after the data scrub began. Lumen opened it in his quarters, the codex resting beside his data slate. The target was unusual. Not a gang lord or corrupt official. Something different. Administratum Logistics Coordinator Gaius Trent. Age 57, 34 years of service. Responsible for managing grain distribution across 17 hive sectors. The file contained evidence of systematic embezzlement. Trent had been diverting food shipments for years, selling supplies on the black market while population starved. The monetary damage was enormous. The human cost incalculable. But that was not why Venn had sent the file. Attached to the dossier was a strategic assessment written in Venn's own hand. Trent is linchpin in fragile supply network. His connections span multiple factions, legitimate administratum, black market operators, even elements within the ecclesiarchy who profit from his distribution schemes. If he dies suddenly, especially now during investigation period, it will trigger factional conflict. Gangs will fight over his distribution routes. Officials will scramble to hide their own involvement. The hive could descend into open warfare over food access. Lumen read the assessment twice. Then he accessed current reports on Varos 9's security status. The situation was already unstable. Cord's data scrub had paralyzed normal Arbite's operations. Gang conflicts over territory had intensified. Civil unrest was rising in lower hive sectors. The planetary governor had authorized lethal force against any gatherings larger than 5 citizens. The hive was balanced on edge. One significant disruption could push it into collapse. And Venn was offering that disruption as a test. No, not offering. Warning. Lumen studied the file's metadata. It had been created 6 hours ago, but it contained information that should have been secured during Cord's data scrub, which meant Venn had copied files before the transfer. Had preserved intelligence he knew the Inquisition wanted eliminated. This was not cooperation. This was challenge. Venn was asking, is Kira about justice or about power? If Light killed Trent, he would be eliminating a criminal who deserved judgment. But he would also be triggering chaos that would kill thousands of innocents through starvation and violence. The moral mathematics was complex. The strategic implications even more so. And Lumen understood immediately that Cord was behind this. She had not created the file, but she had created the situation, had positioned Trent as bait, had let Venn keep just enough access to make offering the file possible. This was trap disguised as opportunity. If Kira killed Trent, Cord would use the resulting chaos to justify even harsher measures. Would declare the entire investigation area a contamination zone. Would purge indiscriminately until the pattern deaths stopped. If Kira did not kill Trent, faith in Kira's judgment would waver. Citizens would question whether this supposed force of justice was real or just selective violence. Either choice served Cord's investigation. Either choice gave her information. Lumen sat very still, analyzing options. Then he opened the codex and began writing. Inquisitor Cord stood in her command center, watching tactical displays that showed Varos 9's hive sectors in real time. Marshal Venn had been predictable. After their confrontation, he had accessed his personal files, the ones he had copied before data transfer. Had pulled Gaius Trent's dossier, had transmitted it through the same encrypted channel he had used to contact Kira previously. Her tech priests had been monitoring all Arbite's communication since arrival. The encryption was sophisticated, but not beyond Mechanicus' capability to trace. Now she waited to see what Kira would do. If Kira is truly pursuing justice, she said to Astropath Liss, who stood nearby, then Trent represents perfect target. Corrupt, murderous through negligence, documented evidence of crimes. But killing him would destabilize the hive, Liss observed. Exactly. Which means Kira faces choice. Justice or order. Punishment of guilty or protection of innocence. Cord pulled up probability matrices on her data slate. Every choice reveals character. Every action provides information. And if Kira chooses neither option, There is no third option. Either Trent dies or he does not. Liz tilted her blindfolded face toward Cord. You have studied many heretics, Inquisitor. Have you ever encountered one who refused to play by rules they recognized? Cord did not answer immediately. Her augmented eye processed the question from multiple analytical angles. Are you suggesting Kira will attempt something unexpected? I am suggesting that precision we have observed thus far indicates intelligence. And intelligent actors sometimes reject binary choices. Before Cord could respond, her tech priest's voice cut through the chamber. Inquisitor. Pattern death detected. Location Black Market Sector 47. Victim identified as Zaz Skern Rax, gang enforcer. Multiple warrants outstanding. Cord frowned. Not Trent. Negative, Inquisitor. Trent's biometric readings remain stable. The death is unrelated to our observation target. Another alert. Second death. Location Administratum Housing Complex Level 312. Victim Mortius Galn, tax collector. Evidence suggests corruption. Cord's augmented eye tracked the new data. More alerts followed. 4 deaths, 6, 9, all within 20 minutes, all cardiac arrest, all targeting criminals and corrupt officials, but none of them were Gaius Trent. What is Kira doing? She said quietly. Then a new transmission appeared on her screens. Not encrypted. Broadcast on open Arbite's frequency. Audio only. Voice modulated beyond recognition. The message was brief. Trent's crimes are documented. His guilt is established. But his death serves no purpose except chaos. Justice does not require collapse. The guilty will be judged. But not at cost of the innocent. Kira. The transmission ended. Cord stood motionless, processing implications. Kira had rejected the binary choice, had acknowledged the trap, had continued killing other targets while deliberately sparing the one that would cause maximum disruption. It was declaration. Not of weakness, but of principles. And it was messaged directly to her. Kira knew it was being tested, knew Cord was watching, and had chosen to respond not with silence or compliance, but with defiance structured as moral clarity. Third option, Lee said quietly. Cord's jaw tightened. Activate contingency protocols. I want full analysis of those 9 deaths. Cross-reference with all available data. Kira just told us it will continue operating despite our countermeasures, which means it still has information access we have not identified. Her officers moved to comply. But Cord remained at the tactical display studying the pattern of new deaths. 9 targets, all legitimate criminals, all chosen to demonstrate capability without triggering chaos. It was efficient, precise, and infuriating, because it meant Kira was not just intelligent, it was disciplined. And disciplined opponents were far more dangerous than passionate ones. Lumen closed the codex and archived the 9 new entries. The broadcast had been calculated risk. It would confirm to Cord that Kira was monitoring Arbite's communications, that it understood the trap, that it was willing to communicate directly when necessary. But it would also establish boundaries. Kira was not random force, not uncontrolled psychic phenomenon, not demon or Xenos intelligence. Kira was moral actor, selective, principled, which meant it could be understood, anticipated, perhaps even negotiated with. And that Lumen knew was exactly what Cord needed to believe. Because an enemy you understood was an enemy you tried to outthink through strategy. An enemy you could not understand was an enemy you simply burned. The broadcast gave Cord reason to continue investigation rather than declare extremists and purge the entire hive sector. It bought time. Time for Methodius's authorization codes to complete their automated capture. Time for Lumen to establish access to databases Cord thought she had secured. Time to prepare for the next phase. His data slate chimed. The backdoor subroutine had completed its work. Methodius's codes were now stored in Lumen's encrypted partition. He accessed the restricted databases, senior administratum files, ecclesiarchy hierarchy records, governor's office personnel, all available, all vulnerable. He opened one file at random. Confessor Halbrecht, complete dossier, registered name, daily schedule, documented movements, even picked captures from security feeds. Lumen smiled slightly. Cord had been correct that Kira required information to kill. But she had been wrong about the source. She had secured existing databases. But she had not considered that new access could be created, that authorization codes could be stolen, that the system itself could be compromised from within. Information was not location, it was flow, and flow could be redirected. He closed Halbrecht's file without making any entries in the codex. The confessor was useful alive, controlling the theological narrative around Kira. Killing him now would be strategically wasteful. But having the option was valuable, because options were power. And power properly applied was justice. He had proven to Cord that Kira had principles, had boundaries, had moral framework that could be analyzed and predicted, all of which was true. But what Cord did not yet understand was that principles did not mean weakness. Boundaries did not mean limitation. They meant discipline, control, precision in service to long-term objectives rather than short-term satisfaction. Kira was not chaos. Kira was not passion. Kira was system override, targeted, methodical, patient. And patience in a galaxy built on fear and immediate violence was the most dangerous weapon of all. Far below in the underhive, a worker listened to the recording that had been circulating through unofficial channels. Kira's broadcast. The voice that had declared protection of innocence more important than punishment of guilty. The worker had no education, could barely read, had spent 47 years in manufactorum assembly lines breathing toxic fumes and watching friends die from industrial accidents that were never investigated. But the worker understood the message. Someone was watching. Someone was judging. Someone was powerful enough to kill untouchables, but disciplined enough to spare innocence. For the first time in 47 years, the worker felt something other than fear or exhaustion. The worker felt hope. And across 17 hive sectors, in hab units and drinking halls, and confession booths, thousands of others felt the same. Kira was not just killing criminals. Kira was building faith. The Kira cult grew in darkness, not organized, not structured, just whispers in hab units and prayers in confession booths. Citizens began leaving offerings at sites where pattern deaths had occurred. Scraps of parchment with names of criminals, pleas for judgment. Crude sketches of eyes watching from shadows. The ecclesiarchy tried to suppress it. Confessor Halbrecht preached that faith belonged to the emperor alone, that Kira was merely instrument of divine will, not deity itself. But the distinction meant nothing to those who had suffered under corrupt officials and gang violence for decades. They had prayed to the emperor for deliverance. The emperor had not answered, but Kira had. Lumen monitored the cult's growth through census vault data and Vox intercepts. It was useful. The offerings provided intelligence names of criminals' locations of black market operations, details of corruption that official channels would never expose. But it was also dangerous. Cults attracted inquisitorial attention, and attention was precisely what he needed to avoid. 3 days after the third option broadcast, Cord made her move. The declaration came through every Vox channel simultaneously. Imperial authority codes, maximum priority, impossible to ignore. By authority of the Ordo Hereticus, I declare Veros 9 Hive Sectors 7 through 14 under extremist heresy protocols. All citizens are commanded to report to designated checkpoints for loyalty verification. Any gathering for purposes of unsanctioned worship is prohibited under penalty of summary execution. The entity known as Kira is declared enemy of the Imperium. All cooperation with this entity constitutes heresy punishable by death. Compliance is mandatory. The Emperor protects. Extremis. Not quite exterminatus, but close. Cord was establishing martial law, lockdown, total information control. Within hours, Arbites and inquisitorial stormtroops began sealing transit routes between hive levels. Checkpoints appeared at every major intersection. Servo skulls multiplied, recording every face, every firsa, every movement, every conversation. And the cult's offerings stopped appearing. Not because faith had died, but because expressing it had become fatal. Lumen observed from the census vault. The escalation was logical. Cord could not find Kira through data analysis alone. So she would create conditions that forced Kira to act or cease entirely. If Kira continued killing during extremist lockdown, each death would narrow the suspect pool. Access to information became scarcer. Every successful execution would indicate remaining access points. If Kira stopped, the cult would collapse. Citizens would conclude that imperial authority had won. Fear would replace faith. Either way, Cord won, unless Lumen found targets that Cord could not protect. He accessed the files he had acquired through Methodius's stolen codes. Senior administratum officials, ecclesiarchy hierarchy, governor's inner circle, all high value. All documented criminals in their own right. But killing them created problems. Their deaths would trigger investigations that would examine access logs, would analyze who had viewed these restricted files recently. And Lumen's access, though, concealed through backdoor subroutines, was not invisible. Forensic examination would eventually reveal it. He needed targets he could eliminate without recent file access. Criminals whose information he had already memorized. Or targets so obvious that anyone could have known them. His data slate chimed. Encrypted message from Ven. Cord has arrested 3 of my officers. Claims they provided files to unauthorized parties. I am under house arrest pending investigation. Cannot communicate further. Destroy this message. Ven. Lumen deleted the transmission and sat motionless. Ven was compromised. The alliance was severed, and Cord was systematically eliminating anyone who might have provided Kira with information. She was not just investigating. She was purging infrastructure. Time was running out. Inquisitor Cord stood in the Arbite's detention block, observing through one-way glass as her interrogator worked on the arrested officers. Not torture. Not yet. Just questions. Methodical, patient, designed to identify inconsistencies in testimony. Astropath Lise stood beside her. You believe these men collaborated with Kira? I believe they had access to files that should have been secured. I believe they copied data before transfer. I believe Marshal Ven operated outside proper authority. Cord's augmented eye tracked the interrogation room displays. Whether they knowingly aided Kira or merely created conditions that allowed it to operate is irrelevant. The result is same. They compromised investigation. And Ven himself. Under observation. If he attempts to warn Kira, we will trace the communication. If he remains silent, we will know he values survival over loyalty to his accomplice. Lys tilted her blindfolded face. I no longer sense the pattern deaths. For 4 days now, nothing. Either Kira has stopped or it is preparing something, Cord finished. Which is why we escalated to extremis. Force it to choose, act and reveal itself, or hide and lose credibility. A tech priest entered Mechadendrites carrying data slates. Inquisitor, analysis complete on the 9 deaths from the third option incident. Cross-reference with vault access logs shows 17 individuals who viewed files on all 9 victims within appropriate time frame. 17 Arats, Cord took the slate. Narrow further. Filter for those who also accessed files on earlier victims. The original 11 plus subsequent deaths. Processing. The tech priest's ocular implants flickered. Result: 4 individuals accessed files on all documented victims. 3 senior archivists and 1 grade 3 scribe designated Lumen Callus. Cord's attention focused. Lumen Callus. Background. Employed in Census Vault for 8 months. Clean record. No disciplinary issues. Assigned to routine mortality census cross-referencing, which would require accessing death records of everyone killed by Kira, Cord said quietly. Perfect cover. Routine work that justifies examining files on every victim. She pulled Callus's personnel file. Registered 8 months ago. No previous employment history in Imperial records before that date. No family, no documented past. Too clean. Bring him in for questioning. Immediately. Lumen was reviewing census files when the Arbites arrived. 4 officers, carapace armor, shock mauls ready. They did not announce themselves or present warrants, just surrounded his desk and spoke with practiced authority. Adept Lumen Callus, you are summoned for inquisitorial questioning. Come quietly. He looked up from his data slate. Mind calculating options at impossible speed. Fighting was suicide. Running was admission of guilt. Compliance was trap. But compliance bought time, and time was what he needed. Of course, he said, standing slowly. What is this regarding? The Inquisitor will explain. They escorted him through the vault corridors. Past clerks who averted their eyes. Past vault keeper Methodius, who watched with expression of profound relief. Someone else was being investigated, not him. Outside, a transport waited. Windowless. Reinforced. The kind used for prisoners who might be dangerous. Lumen entered without resistance. The door sealed behind him. Inside, he was alone, except for servo skulls recording his every movement. He sat on the metal bench and forced his breathing to remain steady. He had perhaps 2 hours before interrogation, maybe less. 2 hours to decide whether to maintain his cover or abandon it. If he stayed as Lumen Callus' innocent scribe caught in investigation dragnet, he would face interrogation, possibly torture. Eventually they would break the cover, because there was nothing beneath it. No real history. No verifiable past. If he abandoned the cover, revealed himself as Light Yagami, claimed foreign origin, and invoked some plausible reason for being on Varos 9, that might explain the gaps. But it would raise different questions, and Light Yagami had no legitimate reason to exist on this world. Either way, the identity was compromised, which meant Lumen Callus had to die. Not physically, but conceptually. The name had to vanish from records, just as light Yagami had vanished into senses corruption 8 months ago. He looked up at the servo skulls, cameras watching, recording. He smiled slightly. Then he closed his eyes and waited. If Cord wanted Kira, she was about to get a response, just not the one she expected. The transport arrived at the Inquisitorial Command Center. Guards opened the door. The prisoner compartment was empty. No body. No evidence of escape. Just empty metal bench and servo skulls still recording footage of nothing. The guards searched frantically, checked seals, reviewed security footage. The recordings showed Lumen Callus sitting quietly for 90 seconds. Then the image flickered 0.2 seconds of static, and when it cleared, the compartment was empty, as if he had simply ceased to exist. Within minutes, the report reached Cord. She studied the footage 3 times, then pulled up census vault logs from 8 months ago. The original identity glitch. The momentary flash of light Yagami beneath Lumen Callus. Not data corruption, she said quietly. Identity replacement. He was never Lumen Callus. He created the identity, wore it like a mask, and when the mask was compromised, he discarded it, Liz finished. Like shedding skin. Cord activated emergency protocols. Locked down all hive sectors. I want every exit monitored, every transport scanned, every identity verified against secure records. Kira is no longer hiding behind routine. It is moving. But even as she gave orders, she knew the truth. Kira was not fleeing. Kira was escalating. And somewhere in the hive's millions, someone who had been light Yagami and then Lumen Callus was becoming someone else entirely. Someone she would have to find before that someone decided the Inquisitor herself was guilty. The purge began at dawn. Not selective, not targeted, just overwhelming force applied to sectors where Kira had operated most frequently. Orbital bombardment coordinates transmitted, strike teams deployed, entire hab blocks sealed and burned. Inquisitor Cord stood on the bridge of the unrelenting verdict, watching fire spread across the hive's lower levels. She had made her calculation. If Kira could not be identified, then Kira's operational environment would be eliminated. 10 million souls lived in the sectors she had designated for purge. Perhaps 100 were actual criminals. The rest were simply citizens who had the misfortune of existing in the same geography as an enemy the Imperium could not locate. Acceptable loss. Astropath, Cord said quietly. Do you sense anything? Liz stood at the viewport, blindfolded, face reflecting fire glow from below. Screaming, fear, death. But no pattern, no precision, just chaos. Liz. Then Kira is either dead in the flames or has evacuated. Cord pulled up evacuation manifests on her data slate. Thousands of refugees were being processed at checkpoints. Every identity verified. Every face cross-referenced against census records. If Light she had stopped thinking of him as Lumen tried to escape through official channels, he would be caught. His face was on file. His biometrics recorded. No matter what name he used, the recognition systems would identify him. Unless he had altered his appearance. Unless he had found a way to corrupt the verification systems themselves. Or unless he had simply chosen to burn. Cord did not believe that. Everything about Kira's pattern suggested survival instinct. Strategic patience. Long-term thinking. Light would not die for a cause. He would escape and rebuild elsewhere, which meant he was already gone. 3 days after the purge, the first new death occurred. Not on Varos 9. On a neighboring hive world called Mortis 7, 2 systems away. An administrative official named Servac Thorn. Documented embezzler. Cardiac arrest. No wounds. Found with confession scratched onto his office wall. Guilty. The report reached Cord within hours. She read it twice, then pulled up transit records. A refugee transport had departed Varos 9, 17 hours before Lumen Callis vanished from the prisoner compartment. Manifest listed 300 evacuees, all verified against census records. All identities confirmed, except census records could be altered, especially by someone who had spent 8 months working in the census vault. Cord cross-referenced the manifest against Deep Archives records that predated recent updates. Found 7 identities that had no corresponding entries in historical files. 7 people who existed in current records but had no documented past. 7 possible identities Light could have created. The transport had made stops at 4 different worlds. By now, those 7 individuals could be scattered across the sector. Could be anyone, anywhere. She had won the battle for Varos 9, had purged the infrastructure Kira relied upon, had eliminated the cult through overwhelming force. But she had not caught Kira, and Kira, it seemed, had learned from the encounter. The death on Mortis 7 was different, not part of a pattern. Not building towards social movement, just a single execution, precise, quiet, then silence. No broadcasts, no signatures, no theology. Just judgment delivered and withdrawn, leaving no trail to follow. Cord closed the report and opened a new file. Case file Kira pattern status ongoing. Subject location unknown, threat, assessment persistent. She typed one final entry. Conclusion. Subject demonstrated ability to operate within Imperial systems while remaining undetectable. Subject abandoned social movement approach after direct confrontation. Current methodology suggests long-term strategy rather than immediate objectives. Recommends sector-wide monitoring for pattern deaths. Subject will resurface. Patience required. She saved the file and archived it. Then she gave orders to prepare for departure. Varos 9 was no longer her concern. The world was broken, but compliant. The cult was suppressed. The investigation was officially closed. Unofficially, she knew the truth. She had not won. She had simply forced her opponent to adapt. An adaptation in a galaxy built on rigid hierarchy and unchanging doctrine was the most dangerous evolution of all. Far below, on Varos 9's surface, in a section of Underhive that had survived the purge, a worker knelt in what had once been a confession booth. The walls were scorched, the benches half collapsed. But someone had cleaned the space, had placed a small candle in the corner, had scratched words into the remaining wall. Kira sees all. The worker did not know if Kira still existed, did not know if the deaths would continue, did not know if faith in unseen judgment was justified or delusional. But for 47 years, the worker had lived under a system that punished the innocent and rewarded the guilty. Had watched friends die in industrial accidents that were never investigated. Had seen criminals walk free while the desperate were executed for stealing bread. And for a brief moment, something had been different. Someone had judged the powerful. Someone had made corruption afraid. Whether that someone still lived or had burned in the purge did not matter. The idea remained. And ideas the worker understood were harder to kill than people. The worker lit the candle, whispered a prayer to both the Emperor and to Kira, not distinguishing between them, and left the booth. Outside, the hive continued its endless decay. Arbite's patrols moved through streets, enforcing order through violence. Administratum officials collected tithes from those who could barely afford survival. The ecclesiarchy preached obedience while counting wealth. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Because now in the darkness, in the spaces between official doctrine and lived reality, a question persisted. What if someone was still watching? What if judgment could still fall? What if Kara was not dead, but simply waiting? The worker did not know the answer. But the uncertainty itself was power. And in the Imperium, where certainty was enforced through brutality and fear, uncertainty was revolution. On a transport approaching Mortis 7, a man sat in the refugee compartment reading a data slate. His identification listed him as Adept Secundus Vex census clerk transferred due to Hive sector collapse. The identity was clean, documented, verified against records that had been carefully constructed over the past 3 months, inserted into archives through methods that left no investigative trail. The man's face was unremarkable, forgettable, the kind that disappeared into crowds and bureaucracy, but his eyes, when he looked up from the data slate, held the same cold calculation they had always held. Light closed the file he had been reviewing. Mortis 7's administrative structure, corruption patterns, enforcement gaps, the same systemic failures that existed on every imperial world, the same opportunities. Varos 9 had been lesson, not failure lesson. He had learned that building social movements attracted attention, that creating cult meant creating target. That being known was being vulnerable. So he would not be known, would not create mythology, would not build faith. He would simply execute, precisely, quietly, efficiently, one target at a time, one world after another. Not seeking justice. Justice was impossible in a galaxy this broken. But delivering judgment where official channels failed. Not as God, not as prophet, not as movement, just as accountant. Balancing ledgers the Imperium refused to balance. The codex rested in his bag, wrapped in cloth indistinguishable from any scribe's documentation. It made no sound, gave no sign of its nature, just paper and ink, just like any other tool. Light opened a new file on his data slate. Senior officials on Mortis 7, documented corruption, accessible information, targets that would not trigger sector-wide investigation. He began compiling names. Somewhere behind him, Inquisitor Cord was closing files and declaring victory. Somewhere below him, Varos 9 burned and rebuilt under extremist occupation. Somewhere in the sector, people whispered about Kira and wondered if judgment would return. None of it mattered. Because Light Yagami had never been about the name, never been about recognition or worship or legacy. He had been about control, about power applied precisely, about proving that systems could be overridden by those who understood them well enough. And he understood now what Varos 9 had taught him. The Imperium did not fear Kira. The Imperium feared losing control. So he would not fight the Imperium, would not challenge its authority, would not build alternative systems. He would simply exist within it, silent, patient, inevitable. A glitch in the machine, recurring, uncatchable, forever. The transport prepared for docking. Light closed his data slate and adjusted his identification badge. Adept Secundus Vex, census clerk. Nobody important, nobody at all. He smiled slightly. In the Imperium, being nobody was the greatest power of all. End. Case file Kira pattern. Investigation status closed Varos 9. Sector status ongoing monitoring. Final entry. The deaths continue. Not frequent, not patterned, just occasional, precise, untraceable. Different worlds, different sectors, different identities. But always the same method, always the same result. Judgment delivered, then silence. The Imperium does not acknowledge the pattern publicly. To do so would be to admit vulnerability, to admit that somewhere in its vast bureaucracy someone operates with impunity. So the deaths are filed as natural causes, as coincidence, as statistical anomaly, and life continues. But in confession booths and hab units, in whispers and prayers, the name persists. Kira, not deity, not demon, not savior. Just question that cannot be answered. Just fear that cannot be extinguished. Just idea that refuses to die. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But sometimes in the spaces between battles, there is also judgment. Silent, patient, eternal. The Emperor protects. But Kira watches. End transmission.